Dr. Jess Sparks, and I'm the Associate Director of the Ecosystems and Environment Program at the University of Nottingham Rights Lab. Today, I will briefly be presenting on projects that my team is working on related to what we call the modern slavery, environmental degradation, and climate change nexus. In this research, we actually work across a multitude of ecosystems, ranging from agricultural work to fisheries, forest, mines, and brick kilns. Diving into it, our team takes what I call a social ecological systems approach to researching this nexus. So what this means is that we believe that there are interconnections and dynamic feedbacks between the human system, where in this case we are primarily focused on modern slavery, and in the ecosystem. So the structure and function of the natural environment that individuals are living and working in. When we talk about modern slavery and environmental degradation and climate change, we're primarily talking about various forms of labor-related abuses. So this may include debt bondage, forced labor, and other forms of labor exploitation. A lot of research is emerging in this area, maybe not a lot, but we're starting to see more and more research emerge in this area. And sometimes there is a tendency to oversimplify the relationship, saying that A causes B, which would be, in this case, would be modern slavery causes environmental degradation, and environmental degradation causes modern slavery, because we do know that this relationship goes both ways. From our perspective, this can sometimes be an oversimplification when we ignore all of those complicated processes that sort of facilitate this intersection, that facilitate these interactions. And I think the biggest benefit of using a social ecological systems approach is that it helps us identify when there are unintended consequences. So for example, we know that labor and modern slavery policy action and environmental policy action are very disparate fields between setting the policy, enforcing the policy, implementing it, etc. And so some of what we study is what is the unintended consequence if we have intervention A in the human system to address modern slavery? Are there benefits or synergies in the natural environment system, or are there actually trade-offs or unintended consequences? And vice versa. When we have interventions in the ecosystem, are there synergies and or trade-offs in terms of what happens to the occurrence and prevalence of modern slavery in that system? So I mentioned trade-offs and synergies. As you may be aware, the Sustainable Development Goals came into force, and they were intended to balance some of the tensions between social, economic, and environmental sustainability, the three dimensions of sustainability. Unfortunately, if you start to unpack the actual goals or targets and indicators under each goal, you will see that there are often a lot of trade-offs and synergies, meaning the achievement of some of these goals may actually be incompatible with the achievement of indicators and targets under other goals. And the importance of trying to identify where we see these interactions through the SDGs is because ultimately we want to maximize those synergies and we want to mitigate the trade-offs that we see. So recently, we undertook an analysis that will hopefully be published later this year or early first thing next year. We underwent an analysis where we essentially pulled a lot of the academic literature, but we also looked at NGO reports, we looked at media reports, etc., that were describing the co-occurrence of modern slavery, which again is the elimination of all forms of it, is SDG 8.7. And we used all of the other the environmental SDG indicators and targets to code these media reports, these NGO reports, and these academic empirical literature that we were finding. And we were trying to determine that based on what was reported, if a policy action or intervention was implemented on either the modern slavery side or the environmental side, would we see a synergy or a trade-off? And what would be the strength of that relationship? And so would they reinforce each other? Were they primary relationships? Were they secondary or tertiary relationships? And this graph is a visual representation of our findings with the main takeaway points that, for the most part, SDG 8.7 and the environmental imperatives of the SDGs are actually very synergistic. We didn't see any evidence of a primary relationship, which is what I was talking about a moment ago, where A causes B. Instead, we saw lots of tertiary or secondary and tertiary relationships, meaning that there are processes that facilitate the relationship between modern slavery and environmental change. And you get a series of essentially knock-on effects that link these two matters. Where we see the biggest trade-offs, which would be where the bars are going inward into the circle, is actually with SDG 7, which is all about clean and renewable energy. This is because most clean and renewable energies rely on renewable batteries, and one of the primary components of renewable batteries is actually cobalt. In cobalt, approximately 2/3 of the world's cobalt is found in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where there are high rates of forced labor, debt bondage, human trafficking, child labor, etc. And so that has left many to wonder if it's actually even possible to have renewable energy that doesn't have modern slavery. In addition, we know that there are reports in high-income countries such as the United States that solar panels may be produced using forms of exploitive labor like prison labor as well. But again, the good news was that in these relationships, we didn't see any primary relationship. It was secondary and tertiary relationships, which means that there's more of an opportunity to try and intervene and mitigate and manipulate some of these processes that facilitate the relationship in hopes that we can mitigate the trade-offs that we see there. So what do I mean by secondary and tertiary relationships versus a primary? And what is the role of poverty? Typically, when we are presenting our research or when we are submitting our research to academic journals, for example, we often get questioned about what is the role of poverty. So we like to think of environmental degradation and climate change as basically exacerbating the cumulative effects of climate change and environmental change are exacerbating inequities that are rooted in poverty. So poverty is that primary relationship, but then once environmental degradation accelerates, climate change accelerates, we start to see a widening spread in inequities and inequality. Once you have this widening spread between the impoverished households and the less or non-impoverished households, what we see is that the impoverished households have decreased resilience and decreased adaptability to their changing environment, and that would include both environmental and climatic change. So for example, migration, which we talk a lot about in this space, less or non-impoverished households might be able to migrate more safely if they have to. If their natural environment is no longer providing the resources to sustain them, if there is some type of natural hazard that was due to climate change and they're no longer able to live in that area and have to migrate, they're much more likely to be able to migrate safely than impoverished households are. In this analysis, we also mapped where we saw these interactions. So this was not a systematic review. So this is just an overarching view, essentially, of what we found. And to be clear, the gray or white areas doesn't mean that those countries or that there are no interactions between climate, the environment, and modern slavery in those countries. It just means that we didn't come across them in our initial searching. This could be in part because our initial searching was reliant on reports, be it academic papers or NGO reports or media reports being in English. So you can see some hotspots include Brazil, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, India, and China. Part of the reason why these are hotspots is because actually many of the extractive industries are actually all found in these countries. So that would include everything from forestry activities to large fishing industries to brick making, etc. And mining. And so you see most of these extractive industries in these countries as well, which also inflates the number of interactions that we see. So during this analysis, we also noted some significant research gaps for the field. So those primary gaps overall are that we haven't really been able to determine yet what is the unique contribution of modern slavery to environmental degradation, and also how do we quantify the unique contribution of environmental degradation and climate change on modern slavery occurrence, prevalence, but also just risk and vulnerability. So our team is currently employing novel strategies from using geospatial data or satellite data to using novel sampling methods to get closer to random sampling for surveys and ground data in order that we can hopefully move towards quantifying those unique contributions, whereas right now we're still in a phase where we mostly just conceptually describe them. Another important research gap that we noticed when we were doing this analysis recently is that very rarely has research attempted to understand the role of time and/or temporality. And so what I mean by that is there's an uptick in deforestation. How long, what is the time gap that we have to intervene before we start seeing the knock-on effects of increased risk and vulnerability to modern slavery? And vice versa. When we start to see an uptick in the occurrence or prevalence of modern slavery, what is the length of time before we actually start to see the environmental degradation? Because of course, environmental degradation often has to happen at a scale that is visible. And so what is that time frame, and what is the importance of that time frame in terms of how we design and develop interventions and how we design and develop policy action? Another challenge in this research space is establishing frameworks to recognize and balance varied knowledge, data sources, and evidence thresholds. So we do a lot of integrating and synthesis of environmental data and modern slavery data. If you're probably very familiar with the modern slavery field, where a lot of our data actually relies on qualitative research, narratives, ground truthing the experience of survivors and victims, etc. We don't see a ton of really large quantitative big data. Whereas on the environmental degradation side, the big quantitative environmental data sets are actually much more of the norm. And when we're talking about doing interdisciplinary research and integrating the two sides, how do we balance diverse epistemologies and ontologies? And this isn't just in the research side, this also bleeds over to the action side. So when we're going to talk to policymakers and decision makers, how do we balance the tension in the evidence thresholds that they're expecting? So for example, I do a lot of work in fisheries, and if I'm going to talk to the fisheries parliamentarian group in the UK about the prevalence or co-occurrence of modern slavery in the fisheries sector, they're not used to seeing, 12 or 15 qualitative narratives used as data. And they may not consider that to be, to meet their threshold of evidence to act. So how do we balance those tensions and really start to achieve interdisciplinary research and interdisciplinary knowledge exchange? We also don't understand the importance and sequence of those facilitating processes that I keep thinking about. So the processes that push individuals into modern slavery or that pull them into modern slavery. And we've also started noticing in our work across sectors that many of these sectors intersect. So I've heard accounts of fishers who are trafficked into the fishing industry, that they actually originated in the palm oil, which involves a lot of deforestation. They might be illegal plantations or engaging in illegal deforestation, and they will actually be recruited and trafficked into then the fishing sector. Same holds true for mining and deforestation, which are closely linked. And so how do these sectors link, and what are the pathways or the journeys of survivors and victims of modern slavery through these intersecting sectors is a really important future question. And last but not least, something that I'm personally very passionate in is understanding the effects of environmental policies on modern slavery. So often when we're developing environmental policy, we like to protect large swaths of land or ocean, and often countries may not have the capacity to actually monitor those areas. And then are we essentially creating swaths of land or ocean where natural resources might be more abundant or start to rebound, yet have a lack of monitoring. So there's actually very low risk of getting caught engaging in illegal activity and very high reward. And so that again goes to the value of using a social ecological systems perspective, especially when we're trying to take quantitative and qualitative data and model it. It helps us see where we might have some of those unintended consequences of policy action. So my team, as I mentioned, works across a variety of sectors, which I will go through briefly. So thinking about climatic change, we are looking at the role of climate change and natural hazards. Some of our key questions include what is the relationship between hazards, anthropogenic disasters, and modern slavery typologies. So there's lots of media narratives about a natural hazard happens and then modern slavery automatically increases. Yet there's little empirical data to actually support or interrogate those relationships. And there's also concern that modern slavery survivors and victims, because they are some of the most hidden people in the entire world, are they actually excluded from climate resilience and climate adaptation activities? And so we know, of course, that a lot of survivors and victims are actually migrants. They may be undocumented migrants. And so are they being excluded from these adaptation and resilience activities? And does that in turn actually make them even more vulnerable to modern slavery post a natural hazard? As I mentioned, renewable energies as well. So we've already talked about sort of the conundrum about many renewable energies relying on renewable batteries, which are produced with cobalt. But we're also starting to think about how can new energies reduce vulnerability to modern slavery. So a project which we're hoping to launch in the very near future is actually looking at can renewable energies reduce energy poverty? We know that in some parts of the world, energy poverty is actually a contributing factor to trafficking of women. It also contributes to their migration into urban areas where they might be more susceptible to trafficking as well. We're hoping to test the effects of having access to portable renewable energies that would increase their ability to boil water, to charge communications, to have electricity for children to participate in education activities, in particular in refugee and humanitarian settings. Mines and quarries as well. So I've mentioned many times the issue with cobalt. So how can we create a slave-free and sustainable circular economy is a key research question for our team. Agriculture, you may or may not be aware that sustainable diets seem to be all the rage these days. And this is actually the UN's designation of the Year of the Sustainable Diet. Unfortunately, what we're starting to investigate is whether sustainable diets are actually based on the three dimensions of sustainability, so social, economic, and environmental, or if they are just very environmentally focused. So we are just wrapping up our analyses, but we have been looking at the risk of forced and child labor and sustainable diets, and comparing them here in the US to the USDA recommended diet, which is based on nutrition, and in general, just the average American diet. The study is very US focused at the moment because it turns out trade data for agricultural commodities is very complex. And so what we're finding is that there's actually increased risk in sustainable diets. But we need to be careful about how we communicate these research findings, because we also have to balance the needs of our planet right now, and that if we continue to use and abuse the planet, that's going to impact marginalized populations that are most likely to end up in modern slavery as well. So it's thinking about how we process our food, how we consume certain commodities, etc. And again, balancing those tensions between the environmental needs and the socioeconomic needs. And also, how do we define decent work in a changing environment? If you're here in the US, you might have seen recently reports about agricultural workers out in California in the extreme heat, in the wildfires with very poor air quality, etc. We know that those occurrences are going to continue to increase and be even more severe as the climate changes. So how do we actually define decent work in an equitable way that's also flexible to accommodate our planet as it's changing, is a very important question. Right now, we tend to define decent work by the antithesis or the absence of modern slavery, the most egregious form. And this often will end up missing various forms of labor exploitation that don't meet those thresholds of the most egregious forms. And again, if a worker is out in the field harvesting a crop, 5 days a week for 10 hours a day in extreme heat, poor air quality, is that more or less decent work than an agricultural worker who might work for 3 nights a week at 12 hours a night overnight because the temperature is cooler or the air quality is better? And these are things that we're going to have to grapple with as we move forward in a world that's changing. Fisheries is where I actually spend most of my time. I've been working in fisheries for about the last 6-7 years. And so there, I primarily look at the links between overfishing-induced fish stock declines and forms of modern slavery, which are primarily forced labor, debt bondage, and human trafficking on fishing boats. There's been lots of talk recently about the relationship between illegal fishing, which is a major driver of overfishing and depleted stocks, and in general, labor abuses and modern slavery. We're getting ready to, our findings should be out any day now, but what we see is that this relationship exists in certain parts of the world, typically low-income countries and the water surrounding them, but that it doesn't exist in other parts of the world. And that's because illegal fishing is not very common in areas of the world where there's strong environmental governance, but that the labor abuses and the modern slavery is actually much, much more widespread than the IUU fishing. And so we see the correlation in some parts of the world because they have weak environmental governance and modern slavery, but we don't see it in parts of the world that are higher income countries because they definitely have modern slavery in their fisheries, but they have environmental governance, pretty good environmental governance structures, so you don't see the IUU at the same rate. And again, with climate change, as water's warm, where are those emerging hotspots going to be? Because we know that fish stocks are starting to shift where they're harvested. And in forest, what is the co-occurrence between modern slavery and tree loss? My colleague, the amazing and brilliant Dr. Beth Jackson, has just published multiple papers looking at this, again, trying to move from co-occurrence to understanding and quantifying how much modern slavery contributes to deforestation and tree loss. Of course, we know that trees are the lungs of the planet, and so they're very important carbon sinks to help us battle climate change. And also, how can decarbonization help in modern slavery? And so that's trying to find a synergy. One of the foremost deforestation programs in the world at the global level is the REDD+ program. And when we sat down and did a conceptual examination, we saw that there are actually lots of synergies between anti-slavery tools and the REDD+ program. And so we're hoping to pilot in a small area where we can actually see the mainstreaming of anti-slavery tools into these decarbonization REDD+ programs. And lastly, just to wrap up about pathways forward. So where do I expect to see the field going in the coming years, and where do I think we need to go? And hopefully we can encourage some of you to join in on this really exciting and novel and emerging research area. In terms of policy and practice changes, like I said, there are lots of synergies. There can also be trade-offs. And so mainstreaming anti-slavery tools, I'm mainstreaming in quotes because I sort of hate that word, sort of like we started mainstreaming gender, a gender lens or a gender approach throughout environmental initiatives. Do we need the same type of mainstreaming of an anti-slavery lens or anti-slavery tools? Also, to prevent some of those unintended consequences of environmental policies, how do we develop multifaceted policy action to prevent that? As I mentioned before, the need to really build inclusivity in climate resilience building activities and making sure that climate resilience building is more equitable and capturing these hidden populations in its ability to communicate the risk of climate change, etc. And also, we talk a lot about research informing policy and having evidence-based policy and practice, but also when thinking about projects and research, my next point, it's important that practice and what we see on the ground is also helping guide the directions of our research. And that has been very prominent in this space. In part, it's been, from Professor Kevin Bales's observations to other NGOs' observations about the co-occurrence of these issues of environmental degradation and modern slavery that really drove the initial agenda of this research area. And so that practice, lens, and experience will continue to be really important in helping us move forward. We also need a lot more longitudinal research. Right now, unfortunately, because of funding constraints primarily, also access, which isn't being helped by COVID, a lot of our research is cross-sectional, which means that we collect data on modern slavery at a point in time. Of course, environmental data, we're much better at collecting many data points over many points in time, and so we get much broader, bigger, in-depth data sets. And it would really be valuable to have longitudinal modern slavery data, because that would just help us start to really pinpoint and identify and quantify those relationships, but also see those patterns and trends. And thematic areas I think are going to be really important for the future. I think really learning how to mitigate the trade-off between the renewable energies and the modern slavery is very essential. But also we know that 1 in 4, it's now predicted in the world by maybe as early as 2050, at least one person in 1 in 4 households may be forced to migrate due to climatic and/or environmental change. Some of that migration may be voluntary, but a lot of it may also be forced. And so how do we make migration safe? And in thinking about equitable resilience building with climate and environment, we really need to start thinking about migration as an adaptation and not a danger. And how do we make sure it's an adaptation and not a danger? Similarly, how do we also ensure that certain governments don't sort of co-opt this risk into using narratives of human trafficking and modern slavery risk to prevent migration, to say that migration is too safe, so migrants need to stay in their home countries, because we know that many of these home countries or areas may not be inhabitable due to climate change and environmental change as we move forward. And as I've already talked about, I think this idea of environmental policies impacts is going to be a really crucial next step for the field, as well as the cross-sectoral intersections of this nexus. So case studies about where we see survivors and victims moving between sectors and being exploited in different sectors. So what are the narratives of their journeys, and how is that movement being facilitated? So that's all I have for today. Myself and my team members, we're always happy and very excited to talk about our research. So I've included my email there. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us. If you're interested in any of our papers, etc., we're always happy to share. And I thank you very much for listening to our talk, and I'm very disappointed that I couldn't be there in person. I grew up in the Midwest, so grew up not far from Nebraska, so sorry that I couldn't come back to that part of the country and to interact with you all and to have great discussions with you all in person, but I do hope that we can continue these discussions online moving forward. Thank you.